All right, if I could have everybody's attention, this is a very meaningful evening for us on many levels. I often talk about our diverse, collaborative, and inclusive community of outstanding students, faculty, staff, alums, and adopted alums, which is a large category of friends of the law school. I want to reflect on a few of those people here tonight, starting with students and recent students. Stephen Lewis Prescott is here, who worked this past summer for an adopted alum, Lance Estrella, and is looking at a career in this area, broadly speaking, natural resources, energy, and the environment. And there are lots of opportunities in this area, and it really requires a community effort to help our students. And the people who I will talk about are all part of this community. And what you all need to know, if you're not already aware of it is harder than ever for our students to find their way, but there are great opportunities there. And one of the inspirations that I have and that literally we share with our students is the career of John Schultz, the benefactor of tonight's lecture. He and his wife Cynthia, who passed away last year, inspire us in many ways. One is their spirit of giving and community engagement. This lecture, along with a Schultz scholarship and a Schultz commitment to loan repayment assistance, are literally having a transformative effect on our community. That leadership matters a lot. What's exciting is to watch that pay it forward directly and also through his example, because when John graduated, he didn't have a job. He went and was a caddy for the summer. He got his first job because of how fast he could type, 95 words a minute, which back in the old days on those typewriters, that was something. They didn't know for the first several months that he was even a trained lawyer. He was perfecting title opinions, but until he started giving legal advice, they didn't realize what they had. And John made his own way, the way all of you can make your own way. And in a wonderful tribute, one of the Schultz scholars, Tara Rigetti, who came here tonight from San Francisco, took John's advice, followed his example, and literally not long after graduating, she's now the chief operating officer of an oil and gas exploration company. And that inspiration and that example is what we're looking to give our students confidence that they can do it, because our students are really fabulous. Stephen is fabulous, Tara's fabulous, and giving them opportunity is honestly what this community is about, first and foremost. In addition to alums like John Schultz, we have alums like Scott Miller. So Scott graduated, and David and Charles, David Getches and Charles Wilkinson, Charles is here as well, were mentors to him. And he went to work at the Interior Department for Bruce Babbitt, was head back then, right? Friends of David and Charles. And he then went to join the staff of Senator Jeff Bingaman, who is now the chair of the Senate Energy Committee. Scott has been really, for us, a prize in D.C., and so it's with a little bit of remorse that we brought him back to Colorado. But we needed him this year because we're in a time of transition. Some of you know about the Natural Resources Law Center's transition. It's not a secret. I announced it at the March conference last June, but we're working on rolling out a enhanced center, which will be known as the Getches Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and Environment. That's a team effort to honor the legacy of all the people who are part of building that Natural Resources Law Center, particularly David Getches and Charles Wilkinson. And that's something you'll hear more about. If you have ideas of people who'd be a fabulous executive director, William Boyd here is chairing the search committee for that. And we're also looking for a program director as well, because we are wanting to enhance the effectiveness of all of our outreach efforts. Again, this Schultz lectureship being a crown jewel of that. For us to get connected to our community, to our adopted alums, people like Lance Estrella or Marky Bell, who's with Newmont, that requires more outreach and engagement. That's what our students need. That's helping them get connected. So let me finish off by talking about a few other meaningful people who are here, mostly the faculty members. I've mentioned already Charles Wilkinson, who many of you know. Where's Charles? He's right here. He is like many people talk about inspiration, the efforts he's putting into developing this Getchus Wilkinson Center are inspiring and above and beyond. His partners in that among the faculty who are also here tonight, William Boyd, who I've mentioned is stepping up to help chair the search as we look for a new executive director, Sarah Krakoff, who's here also with us tonight, and Bruce Kramer, who's on the Center's advisory committee and an adjunct professor. There are others who I haven't probably spotted, and thank you for your leadership. We need you all, and we value you all as part of our community. Finally, I've talked a bit about David Getchus and his legacy. Ann Getchus is here tonight, and we're so thrilled to have you as a part of our community. So the Schultz Lecture has a great legacy already. David worked with John to set this up. Bruce was the first person to give the lecture. We've had leaders from government, industry, and academia, and that will continue to be the case as we have this crown jewel. Literally this year, when I talked to some people about the first possible choice, there were only two names on the list, Jeff Bingaman and Secretary Chu. And I was partial to Jeff because I've known his wife, Ann, since I joined the Antitrust Division in 1996. And for those who don't know Ann Bingaman, you're in for a treat if you get to know her. She and Jeff are an amazing story. They met at Stanford Law School when there were only 6 women at Stanford Law School. And somehow, with all that competition for her affections, Jeff won her over, and she came back to New Mexico, where she's had a storied career in the law, in academia, in the public sector, in the private sector, and as an entrepreneur. Meanwhile, she supported her husband, who had a career in public service. And Jeff's career in public service started with a run for Attorney General, and then went to the United States Senate. Coming from New Mexico, his specialization in natural resources and energy issues should not surprise anybody. And he's now chair of that committee. And I will tell you, he represents almost the Mr. Smith goes to Washington ideal of a senator. We are very fortunate in this state to have 2 senators who also fit that ideal. In a time when politics is more and more divisive and more a fact-free zone, we need to treasure our public officials like Jeff Bingaman. And we're so happy you're here with us tonight. Senator Jeff Bingaman.
Well, thank you very much for the overly generous introduction and the invitation to be here, and particularly the invitation to give this 5th annual Schultz Lecture at the university. I appreciate the invitation of the law school and also the generosity of the Schultz family. And John, thank you very much, and all of the family for your commitment to the school. Let me also mention that my wife Ann is here with me tonight, and oh, she's sitting over there. I was wondering where she went, but she's sitting over here, and glad to be here with me as well. We are glad to be going back to New Mexico beginning this next year, and I think some of you from the West can probably understand that. Let me also mention Scott Miller. Scott worked with me and others on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, has done a tremendous job on all sorts of issues related to public lands and forestry and renewable energy. And your gain here at the law school is definitely our loss in the U.S. Senate with Scott's move back to Colorado. The University of Colorado and nearby research institutions, which all of you know well, including the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, Rocky Mountain Institute, have been at the forefront of thinking and research on clean energy. And your work on a variety of energy policy subjects has had an important effect on national government and on industry. As we focus in Washington, or try to focus at least, on how the various strands of energy policy come together into some kind of coherent national policy, I think it's appropriate to try to look at 3 overarching questions, and I'll try to do that tonight. First, what should be our energy policy goals? Second, what are the factors that determine whether and how quickly we achieve those goals? And third, what policies should we adopt? What action should we take as a country to try to improve our prospects for achieving those goals? So let me summarize what I believe should be the overarching goals of national energy policy. I'll do it in 6 different points. First goal, we should promote robust domestic production of affordable energy from a diversity of sources. The tendency in energy markets and in energy policy over the years has been to focus on whichever energy supply option is topical at the moment, and to act as though that source of energy is going to solve all our problems. And whether it's renewables or coal or natural gas or nuclear power, that seems to be the one that gets attention. The reality of our energy system, of course, is much different. Our energy consumption as a country is vast. We need all potential energy sources if we're going to meet those energy needs, and maintaining diversity among energy supply sources is crucial. Therefore, we can't afford only one type of energy infrastructure. In energy, I'm persuaded that diversity of supply is security of supply. Second goal is that we should promote efficiency in the transmission, distribution, and end use of energy. Obviously, it's not enough to simply have a policy that focuses on creating more and more energy. We need to use the energy that we create more wisely, and what that means having effective infrastructures for moving energy to where it is needed, so we don't have to build redundant sources of supply. It also means that we can focus on the most highly efficient end-use technologies for energy, so that we do not waste energy to any greater extent than necessary. Third goal, we should ensure that the market structures that establish energy prices and allocate energy supplies are transparent and efficient and effective. There was a time back in the 1970s when the government directly set energy prices and allocated energy supplies, and that did not work very well. Since then, our national energy policy has been to rely on market forces to set prices and allocate supplies. But reliance on market forces to provide good energy outcomes means that you need one very important thing. That is, you need to ensure that energy market forces are free from manipulation and that they operate in an open and a transparent way. Otherwise, energy producers and consumers cannot make rational and cost-effective plans. The fourth goal I would mention is that we need to maintain an appropriate balance between achieving energy policy objectives and environmental objectives. Energy policy issues are intimately intertwined with environmental issues, and to have policies in either the area of energy or the area of the environment that will stand the test of time, we need to look at both sets of issues together. Broadly speaking, I'm persuaded that we need to accelerate a transition to a clean energy economy where we can maximize both the environmental benefits and the energy benefits. And I think that is possible. Fifth goal, we need to maintain our world leadership in energy research and development and innovation. At any point in time, our ability to implement an energy strategy and to achieve some of the preceding goals, some of the 4 goals I've just gone through there, we'll run into a roadblock or some insoluble problem. And this is the point at which new science and new technology comes into play. And by creating new options for achieving our energy goals, we can ensure that we have a comprehensive energy policy and that those goals are in fact achievable. Any country that wants to have a world-class energy policy also needs to have a world-class innovation system. The final goal I'd mention is that we need to focus on creating U.S. jobs and realizing the other economic benefits that can result from pursuing the previous 5 goals. So as we design a national energy policy, we need to look for ways in which that policy can build the general economic strength of the United States. Having a dominant position in innovation means that we have universities and other research institutions that train scientists and engineers who contribute not only to solving our energy problems, but who are also capable of innovation in the broader economy. And companies will generally locate their manufacturing operations where they have significant markets for what they're producing. So building those strong markets for advanced energy technologies means that we can have a better chance of capturing the high-value manufacturing jobs associated with those technologies. So these are 6 goals that I think define what ought to be meant when people say that we have a comprehensive energy policy. I'm persuaded that you can't have a comprehensive energy policy if you refuse to consider environmental effects. You cannot have a comprehensive energy policy when you focus on one source of energy to the exclusion of others. You need to look at the entire architecture that these 6 goals represent. And as energy policy debate continues for the next 4 weeks till we get the election over with, and in the next presidential term, I think these 6 goals provide a pretty good checklist to judge whether energy proposals are truly comprehensive and sustainable over the long term. So now that we've got these 6 goals in mind, I'd like to move to the second point. That is, what factors will determine our success in achieving these national energy goals. I'd list 4 obvious types of factors. These are the speed of scientific and technological advancement. Second, market forces and the evolution of markets. Third, policies and actions of other nations. And finally, the policies that we ourselves adopt and the actions that we ourselves take. First, let me say a few things about this speed of scientific and technological advancement. To a great extent, we can influence this by the investments that we decide to make in fundamental and applied research and the speed with which we encourage new innovations to get to the marketplace through other types of supporting policies. At the same time, there are new scientific and technological advances that do not always operate according to our initial thoughts. In 1987, scientists discovered high-temperature superconductivity. It was predicted at that time that we would shortly thereafter see superconducting wires as a major part of the electric transmission system. Here we are 25 years later. Progress on that front has come very, very slowly. On the other hand, we're in the middle of a technological revolution in how we produce natural gas and how we produce oil from tight formations such as shale. This was a breakthrough that virtually no one in the oil and gas industry saw coming a decade or 2 decades ago, and nobody in government saw it coming either. Let me go on to the second item, market forces and how markets evolve. Obviously, they have tremendous influence over our ability to achieve our energy goals. Their market forces are the main determinant, in fact, of the decisions that are made by utilities, by businesses, and by consumers in meeting their energy needs. As this slide shows, when the price of natural gas falls to historic low levels, as it has, with the prospect of remaining at those low levels for a very long time, it doesn't matter what government policies you enact, you cannot counter that market reality. You need to recognize that and work with that. Probably the most significant market evolution that is underway worldwide, in my view, is the flat and declining demand for energy in the developed countries, such as our own OECD countries in this left-hand chart here, coupled with the strongly growing demand in the developing world. I think these 2 slides show that this reality in energy markets will dominate energy policy worldwide for several decades. Third set of factors that I think clearly need to be recognized and as affecting our ability to reach our energy goals are the policies and actions of other nations. We've seen this effect for the past few decades in the control that OPEC has been able to exercise on world oil prices. For decades now, the benchmark price for oil that OPEC has set has been an important factor in driving demand and technology selection in the transportation sector. What Americans have to pay at the pump has also been greatly affected by decisions of OPEC. Another example is shown in this slide, and this is how policies, this is another example of how countries' policies have affected our own national energy goals. This shows the sharp decline in the price of photovoltaics due to Chinese government policies to greatly expand their manufacturing of key materials and components in solar cells. This development poses a mixed picture for our own policies. On the one hand, by making solar panels available at lower prices, it encourages deployment of solar energy power in this country. On the other hand, there are obvious negative consequences. It undermines the financial incentive for anyone to manufacture key solar energy equipment in the United States. As China, along with other key developing countries such as India and Brazil and Russia, continue to expand their consumption of energy and their development of energy resources, their national policies will have major implications for world prices of energy and thus for the policies that we should adopt as well. And the final point I wanted to make here is perhaps the most important point for our purposes, and that is, what are the factors what can we ourselves do in the policies we adopt and the actions that we take to affect our ability to meet our energy goals? I'll devote the rest of the time I have here to that subject. That is where our own policies stand in Washington in particular. Most of what Congress does and is able to do to affect energy, to affect the ability to reach our energy goals, involves exercising one of three powers: the power to spend, the power to tax, and the power to regulate. As regards energy policy, in each of these three areas, Congress has had a bipartisan consensus about how to proceed in fairly recent years. And that consensus has resulted, I would argue, in fairly significant progress over the past decade in several key areas, including transportation, building efficiency, and the electric grid. Let me mention a few areas where we have made progress in each of those. In the transportation sphere, we made significant progress by to make vehicles more efficient by increasing CAFE standards. We were able to do that in 2007 for the first time in 30 years. We raised CAFE standards. Both the 2007 Act and the Energy Policy Act in 2005 took steps to diversify the fuels that we use in transportation, away from just using oil by mandating greater use of biofuels. In the 2005 Act, we also contained provisions to make it easier to process permits for producing oil and gas on federal lands, helping in this way to continue to produce oil that was needed during the very long transition to other transportation energy sources. In commercial and residential buildings, the 2007 Act made progress in updating national energy building codes, in making the federal government a leading purchaser of efficient buildings, in improving the capacity of states and local governments to implement programs to increase building energy efficiency. The Energy Efficiency Block Grant Program that was created in the 2007 Act and was funded in the Recovery Act resulted in a host of state programs that greatly expanded the number of certified home energy inspectors, the number of home energy renovation firms in the country. The 2005 Act also created an array of new tax incentives that for the first time provided incentives for the purchase of energy efficient appliances and equipment. With respect to the electric grid, the 2005 Act put in place the first mandatory standards for electricity reliability. It took steps to make it easier to site new power transmission lines. The 2005 Act also put in place strong consumer protections and outlawed the sort of electric price manipulation that Enron was accused of engaging in connection with the California electricity crisis. The 2007 Act created a significant new program to help implement the smart grid. This was a program that also benefited from substantial investments in the Recovery Act. So in transportation, in building efficiency, and in the electric grid, there has been some progress at the national level. However, the reality today is that the congressional consensus that led to that progress in those areas has unraveled. Today, we in Congress are having great difficulty coming to agreement on what should be done with regard to each of these three powers that I mentioned: the power to spend, the power to tax, and the power to regulate. Let me just be a little more specific. In the case of spending, we once had a consensus in favor of a range of support mechanisms for research and innovation and deployment of new energy technologies. These included direct support for research and development, use of the federal government's procurement power to encourage advanced energy technologies such as biofuels, grants to state and local government to spur their energy efforts. The consensus also included indirect federal support in the form of loan guarantees for advanced energy technologies. But as I say, this consensus to maintain and even increase spending on energy-related research, innovation, and deployment has come apart. We see this in the stagnation of funding to support these areas, in proposals by some in the Congress to cut all federal spending, no matter how beneficial, across the board. We see it in an amendment adopted in the Armed Services Committee of the Senate, in the bill that they have now reported to the full Senate, where a majority of the Senate Armed Services Committee voted to limit the ability of the Department of Defense to purchase biofuels to serve its energy needs, even though the department argues that through biofuels they can get enhanced fuel diversity and security benefits for military missions. And we see it, of course, in the political fallout from the Department of Energy's loan to Solyndra, which sends a potent signal that spending through the loan guarantee process is very much out of favor in the Congress today. This loan guarantee program that is now under such attack was one that was championed both by Senator Domenici and myself in the 2005 legislation. It's a shame that people think the Department of Energy loan guarantee program is just about one or a few solar panel producers in California. The program is actually the largest source of debt financing for clean energy in the United States, either public or private. It's made over $35 billion in direct loans and loan guarantees for projects totaling about $55 billion. Just one of those loans, which made possible the construction of the world's largest solar photovoltaic power plant, resulted in $1 billion worth of orders for U.S. suppliers this last year. Yet on the 14th of September of this year, the House of Representatives passed a bill entitled the No More Solyndras Act that would prohibit the Department of Energy from funding any new loan guarantees for applications submitted after 2011. This seems to me a very short-sighted approach, and one that will essentially sacrifice to other nations any lead that we might have had in the development and deployment of some of these new technologies. The second of the three congressional powers that I mentioned, the power to tax or provide tax relief more specifically, or tax preferences, this power is historically at least as important a policy tool for the Congress as the power to spend. But here as well, the Congress finds itself unable to agree on what provisions should be enacted or which provisions should be maintained to meet our national energy goals. For years, over 2/3 of federal spending on energy has come through tax expenditures, not through direct spending, but through tax expenditures in the tax code, most often in the form of various incentives to promote research and development, to promote oil and gas production, to promote nuclear power, to promote advanced biofuels and renewable energy and energy efficiency. The recent focus on clean and low carbon energy was established in 2005 through the Energy Policy Act that we enacted that year, and that was under a Republican Congress and a Republican president. This act significantly expanded tax incentives for renewable energy. It created a suite of new incentives, both at the residential and the utility scale, along with state policies, a federal renewable fuel standard. These incentives are likely responsible for driving a significant amount of the recent increase that we've seen in the deployment of wind and solar and biofuels and other clean energy sources. The Congressional Research Service recently found that incentives for wind energy alone helped create over 420 manufacturing facilities for wind components in states across the nation. Some in the Congress, of course, now and elsewhere as well, oppose maintaining tax incentives for clean energy. At the end of 2011, Congress failed to extend more than 10 expiring provisions directed at clean energy. Several attempts to extend those provisions retroactively this year have also failed. In addition, the primary tax credits supporting wind power expires at the end of this year, as do important tax credits that support advanced biofuels such as cellulosic ethanol. The impending demise of these incentives is having a strong negative impact on the wind energy industry. I should not have to make that point here in Colorado. One estimate is that with the expiration of the wind production tax credit this year, 37,000 wind-related jobs will be lost nationwide. Many of those jobs will be lost here in your state. Even assuming that we are able, in the lame duck session coming up in the Congress, to extend some of these tax provisions, we face a much broader problem. We have essentially two different tax codes for energy. One tax code consists of permanent incentives that were put in place before the enactment of federal budget controls in the 1970s. And because these provisions were enacted in the 50s and 40s, and even in some cases the 20s, they focus on and favor older energy technologies and options. The other tax code consists of energy incentives put in place since the 1970s, and because of federal budget rules, these provisions have to be paid for. So they generally are not permanent, they are short-term. Every few years they expire. They have to be renewed with a new set of budget offsets to pay for the cost each time they are renewed. So these tax incentives deal with new energy technologies such as renewable energy and energy efficiency. This system of on and off tax incentives, while partially helpful to new energy technology deployment, has proven not to be the sort of sustained signal that is really needed in order to unleash innovation in the marketplace. So we have a very uneven playing field in the tax code for energy technologies. We essentially are picking winners and losers. But we pick winners and losers on the basis of whether they entered the tax code before the 1970s or since the 1970s. We need, in my view, a set of long-term policy signals that are more predictable than this and that are more rational. Final tool that the Congress has to try to help us meet national energy goals is the ability to regulate. Some of that regulation is in the form of direct energy standards, such as the standards mandating increased efficiency for commercial products, for commercial equipment. Another form of regulation, of course, is requirements affecting energy production practices. Examples are in the area of regulation of coal mining, regulation of hydraulic fracturing techniques, A final category of energy regulation addresses environmental consequences of energy that are not reflected in energy prices. These are the so-called environmental externalities, such as global climate change resulting from greenhouse gas emissions. Again, in this area of regulation, we are seeing substantial pushback across the board in Congress on energy regulation, even in areas which were subject to bipartisan agreement a few short years ago. For example, one of the most effective long-term provisions in the 2007 Energy Independence and Security Act was a set of consensus standards for improving efficiency both in appliances but particularly in lighting. Those standards in the lighting area were agreed to and supported by a broad coalition of energy efficiency advocates, but also people from the affected industry. And based on that consensus, the U.S. lighting industry made very substantial investments over the last 5 years in reworking their product lines and their manufacturing facilities. Today, you can walk into any Home Depot or any Lowe's and see a wide array of lighting choices, from improved incandescent lighting to LED light bulbs, all of which are guaranteed to save the consumer money. Yet these efficiency standards have become the fodder for political attacks on cable TV and in the Congress. And this year, the House of Representatives has already passed a proposal to block enforcement of these lighting standards by the Department of Energy. And this is in spite of the fact that no major manufacturer is opposed to these regulations, and despite the fact that IKEA, the world's largest home furnishings retailer, has just announced that by 2016 it will sell only LED lighting and bulbs. Another example of the rush by the Congress to go back on regulations that up until recently were non-controversial and bipartisan is the so-called Stop the War on Coal Act, which was passed in the House of Representatives on the 21st of September. This bill would roll back clean air regulations controlling mercury and toxic air emissions that are estimated to save over 11,000 lives each year, with health benefits estimated at about $90 billion a year. It would also, this legislation would also block the recently finalized national program of fuel economy and greenhouse gas standards for model years 2017 through 2025 cars and light trucks. Further, the legislation would create uncertainty around the requirements affecting model years 2013 through 2016 for vehicles. Improving the fuel economy of cars and trucks reduces our dependence on imported oil, it cleans the air, it saves consumers money at the pump, and it prevents global warming. And these used to be goals that had broad bipartisan support in Congress. So the fact that the House of Representatives could pass a bill to unravel that progress, to me, seems deeply troubling. So the simple fact is that the general consensus in Congress on the energy goals we are trying to achieve as a nation is no longer in place. Whether we're talking about spending or taxing or regulating, the Congress can no longer reach the consensus or achieve the consensus on what action we should take. The general agreements that we had as underlying the legislation in 2005 and 2007 energy bills no longer holds. With regard to the outlook for the future, I hope that the coming election will give us some wisdom about how to proceed in Congress, and we can once again find some areas of agreement, but I'm not sure that we can do that unless we get more involvement and pressure from the public. Some of the outlines of our energy future, there's a lot of uncertainty about our energy future, of course, but some of the outlines of that future seem fairly clear, even though we don't know the details. Let me just describe 3 key trends that I think will play out in the future, regardless of what Washington determines to do. First trend is that developing countries will dominate energy consumption growth and energy infrastructure development in the future. They will be the prime market for new energy technologies, and we can either compete in and try to shape those markets, those strongly growing markets, or we can leave it to other nations to do that. A second trend, the increase in fossil fuel consumption in the developing countries will outstrip any increase that we can achieve in our own domestic production. The price we pay for oil is set on world markets, and these prices are almost certain to continue going higher and to be more volatile in future years. We can either make strong efforts to decrease our oil intensity in our economy, or we can maintain our vulnerability at its current level. My view is we should maintain and increase production to the extent possible, but we should find ways to reduce our vulnerability to world oil shocks. I hope we're able to do that. The third trend I'd mention is that climate change concerns have obviously taken a back seat during the current economic crisis, but the science of what is happening and the need to transition to a lower carbon energy world is not in doubt. We can either plan ahead now to minimize the costs of climate change to our children and grandchildren, or we can saddle them with those higher costs and global instability that goes with that. So these future trends argue for a continued thrust toward an efficient, low-carbon, sustainable energy system. I'm glad to see that both New Mexico and Colorado have been able to be at the forefront of clean energy policy at the state level. Both states have incentives and standards in place for development and production of renewable energy. I congratulate you on the substantial progress that's been made here in Colorado in that regard. Nationally, we need to reestablish a consensus to pursue our national energy goals. Some progress in achieving those goals has been made, but much more needs to be done. We all recognize that. I hope that we can have the good sense as a nation to continue the constructive efforts that have been started. Thank you very much.
So Senator Bingaman has agreed to have some questions. What I had suggested, and hopefully there are cards available, people can write down their questions and they'll be collected and sent up front. If you want to have a seat with me here or stay there, whatever is easier.
That's great.
You deserve a seat after that address. So I want to start with the first couple of questions, and we'll have some students hopefully bring other ones up here, filter in. The huge takeaway from your remarks was the unraveling of this consensus that was not that long ago. You had a fairly well-developed set of premises, and you mentioned a couple of the laws now coming through on the House side that go right to the heart of some of those issues. The one that kind of I find particularly perplexing is the energy efficiency on light bulbs. The only thing that comes to mind like that is in the House dining room, they've made a concerted decision to have non-recyclable products to serve like any food on. So they go out of their way to buy stuff that's non-biodegradable. I don't understand that because, like you say, major American corporations have made this transition, like IKEA or McDonald's and biodegradable. What's going on there, and is there some reason to believe that we may get back to where we were?
Well, I can't tell you exactly what's going on. I think that we have some who are strongly of the view that any government regulation is objectionable, and trying to set standards for efficiency on light bulbs is seen as a great detriment to personal freedom. I don't see it that way, but that's the argument that's essentially made.
Let me segue to an interesting moment I had when I was working in the government. The vice president came out to NREL to give a talk about energy innovation, and you obviously served with then Senator Biden, one of his gifts was that he was very aware of communicating to the public, something I think you address here as a wonderful window onto energy policy. And that's something that we as a nation, and I think you adverted to this, get the public, that regulation is not a dirty word. Interestingly, in the first president's debate, Mitt Romney said as much. He said, yes, I'm for some regulation. We need it. We have regulations that govern how fast you drive on the roads and what side you drive on. Again, can the public be engaged in energy policy? Because one of the concerns that now Vice President Biden was noting is the more we make these issues complicated, the harder it is to get the public aware of them and create the wellspring that, as you said, we need to get our policy back on track.
Well, I think my sense, of course, this is a perspective from being a senator from New Mexico, but my perspective is that most of the American public favors moving to a cleaner mix of energy sources and favors whatever is reasonable that will improve energy efficiency. Obviously, they don't want it to be done in a heavy-handed way, but they do not consider setting efficiency standards for lighting that heavy-handed. That's been the experience I've had.
So you didn't tout your own legislation here, but when I was in the White House, I heard a lot about your leadership on clean energy standard legislation. Could you just tell people what you've outlined and where you see that in terms of reshaping the debate in terms of what regulatory and other tools could move us more towards a clean energy economy?
Well, most of the legislation that I've worked on that actually got enacted in the energy area got rolled into one of the two bills that I talked about, the 2005 legislation, the 2007 legislation.
What about your more recent ideas around a clean energy standard?
Well, that one hasn't been enacted, but it's a great proposal. I mean, it is an alternative to trying to, it essentially tries to put in place in the utility sector, electric utility sector, something which would be a substitute for a cap and trade system by saying utilities can produce power from whatever source, and we will determine what the extent of the greenhouse gas emissions are that result from that production. And we will give credits to them for producing power with zero greenhouse gas emissions. We will give partial credit if they use natural gas, for example, because there's substantially less greenhouse gas emissions from that kind of power production than there is from coal. And in the case of coal, they get credit as well if they use the latest technology to deal with the carbon emissions from coal. So it is a proposal that makes a lot of sense. It's one that quite a few of my Republican colleagues talked favorably about in previous Congresses. We put it together as a bill and introduced it in this Congress, and I think we have about 11 co-sponsors, but unfortunately they're all on the Democratic side.
So a question I'm sure you never got before, but follows on to your answer. Why not just do a carbon tax?
Well, the problem with the carbon tax is that the word tax is a dirty word in Washington.
Unfortunately, you had three words up there: spending, regulation, and tax. As far as I can tell, they're all dirty words right now.
They're all dirty words, but people say, why don't you raise the gas tax, for example, so that we can do a better job fixing our highways. The last time, I tell people this story, the last time we raised the gas tax was the first year President Clinton was in office. And we raised it 4.3 cents per gallon as part of the major budget bill that we passed in 1993. Someone asked me once, they said, no, 4.3 cents, why didn't you go to 4.5 cents? That would have been a more normal thing to do. Well, the answer was we didn't have enough votes. We had people saying, I won't vote for it if it goes above 4.3. So to get the votes necessary to pass it, we had to do it at 4.3. It's very hard to raise taxes of any kind, and particularly energy-related taxes.
In a fun trivia question, the swing vote, one of the last votes in the House, was a congresswoman from Pennsylvania. Was it Marjorie Mezvinsky?
Right.
Whose son married Bill Clinton's daughter. So
That was
she was the person who said, I'm sorry, I can't go above 4.3. But at least I guess they got that vote, so they did pass that budget bill. You might also address another one of the big questions, which is corn ethanol. The concept started and got some real traction and now is getting questioned, particularly as corn prices are going up. What's the status of those subsidies? I believe there was a moment where I'm not sure what the tax group was, but they said if you vote to decrease the tax credit for corn subsidies, that would be viewed as a tax increase. And Congress did not move to decrease those subsidies. How do you see that debate?
Well, in fact, we did eliminate the tax credit for ethanol, but we kept in place the requirement under the fuel standard that you use a certain amount, you blend a certain amount of ethanol with each gallon of gasoline. So, in fact, there's still a government mandate that supports the use of ethanol. Now, the hope has been, and I think still is, that we can develop cellulosic ethanol that will make a lot more sense.
Is that same thing as switchgrass, or is that different?
Well, switchgrass is one type, is one source. But the idea is we can develop cellulosic ethanol, which would take the place of corn ethanol, which would mean that we were essentially producing a biofuel that did not in any way affect the price of food staples.
I have two questions on this. I've already asked it, but I'll ask it again because it is perplexing to know people, which is, if there is support in the corporate community and in the public for things like energy efficiency and developing renewable energy, which, as you say, the world is moving more in that direction, why is Congress not more in sync with that, and what's going to take to get that message through?
Well, I think the public is not as outspoken on it as I think they're going to have to be in order to get the message through. I think that this has not been a front burner issue. The president, I think, has stuck with his position. He said in his State of the Union speech earlier this year that he would not walk away from the promise of clean energy. I think he means that. He's trying to find ways to continue that effort. And I'm sure he will if reelected. But the public this has not been a rallying cry in this campaign, at least as far as I've seen.
Your talk was really comprehensive. You touched a lot of points, but I've had a couple of people note two things you didn't touch, so I'll mention them. And for those who want to hear more on those, come to our Changing Energy Mix conference on October 23rd. Number one is energy storage technology, and number two is the siting and deployment of new transmission infrastructure that will help renewable energy in one part of Colorado, say, get to another part of Colorado or to California. What are your thoughts on those two
Well,
issues?
on storage, clearly we have invested a substantial amount. Quite a bit of funding from the Recovery Act went into trying to support battery technology development. And that's an extremely high priority. There's no question as we use more and more intermittent sources of energy, we need to put more and more emphasis on storage capabilities as well. And I think that the Department of Energy, you should have had Stephen Chu here, he could have given you a very well-educated response to that question, because
We're very happy with our choice.
No, he has I have great respect for him, and he has made this a priority. So on transmission lines, we made a ineffective effort at trying to get the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission more authority to assist with siting of transmission lines. Frankly, we haven't had the votes in this Congress to go back and do more, but what is needed, in my opinion, is for some agency at the federal level, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is the obvious agency, has to be given the authority to make decisions to go ahead and site transmission lines where it makes good sense after the states have exercised their prerogatives. As I say, we haven't been able to get the votes to do it.
So 2 questions on a similar theme. The science around global warming seems very powerful, and recent articles talking about what's happening to the icebergs in the Arctic is just one example of that. When do you see that consensus getting clearer and that debate moving on from is global warming happening to how do we mitigate it and adjust to it? Because there is, as I adverted to earlier, a real opposition to hearing from the scientists on that issue.
Well, frankly, we have a dysfunction in one of our national parties.
Not to be partisan about it, but
Right. I mean, the truth is, we have a reasonable number of Republicans in the Senate who recognize the dangers from global warming, and in previous Congresses have been willing to join with Democrats in trying to come up with solutions to the problems of global warming. And you probably know the names of those senators as well as I do. But in this Congress, we have been unable to get any Republican support to take any action to deal with global warming. And I think it has a lot to do with the influence of the Tea Party in the Republican Party and concerns they have about being challenged in future primary elections.
so given your expertise in the American West, another topic that is pregnant in what you talked about but didn't actually tease it out was how energy policy and water policy come together in different ways. Could you talk a little bit about the ways in which those two areas interact and some of your thoughts?
Well, they interact very directly. I mean, the more water you use, the more energy you use as a general matter, and clearly we need to be setting water policy and energy policy in tandem so that we understand the effects of one on the other. But there's no question that we use an awful lot of water in the production of a lot of the energy that we use these days. And whether that is being done in the most efficient way, I think is open to question.
So in what you just said, obviously fracking comes to mind. What do you think in terms of the state of play on what national and state level policy should be developed regards to the use of hydrofracking?
Well, my own view
Hydrofracturing.
is we've had hearings on this in our Energy Committee, and the conclusion I draw from it is that fracking, if the best practices are followed in the drilling and the fracking, most problems can be resolved. The one issue, and Dan Yergin, who spoke at this lecture last year, was a witness we had before our committee. I think the one issue which the federal government probably would have the biggest involvement in is the whole issue of the methane that is released.
Mm-hmm.
It's not so much contamination of water, because that can be dealt with by following best practices in drilling. But the escaping methane can be a serious problem which needs to be looked at, and the EPA is looking at it.
So hydrofracturing developed, I believe, from research and development sponsored by the federal government. One of the challenges is communicating to people about why research and development in the energy area is important. Because when you talk about spending priorities, research and development doesn't lend itself to immediate benefits. They don't have constituents here today because it's companies often of tomorrow and consumers of tomorrow get the benefit. So how do we both better make the case and better leverage our research and development budget so that it's most effective?
Well, I do think, the figures that I've been given are that about 3% of revenues, no, about 0.3% of the revenues generated in the energy sector generally are spent on research and development. That in the case of computers and electronics, it's more like 9%. In the case of the pharmaceutical industry, it's more like 19%. We have a substantial shortfall in the amount we invest in research related to meeting our energy needs, and that's been the case for a long time. I think many in the industry recognize it and support doing better by research and development in the energy sector, but it's been difficult to get the support, as you say, and I think the President is asking for increases, has in each of the budgets that he's submitted to the Congress since he's been in office, and I would expect that would continue.
I want to wind up. We've had a few questions following up some of your articulation of the legacy treatment of, let's call it, traditional energy sources versus newer energy, particularly some of the tax breaks and tax treatment of oil and gas. So when you talk about the legacy tax treatment, which ones in particular are you talking about, and would you advocate changing or getting rid of some of them, or is it more of parity by ensuring that they're, both old and new sources of energy have similar treatment? What's your view on that?
Well, my own view is that we need to scrutinize each of the various tax provisions. There are some which frankly make no sense to maintain. The Section 199 deduction, which the oil and gas industry benefits from now, it was proposed as a tax benefit to encourage manufacturing. And as things happen when they go through the Congress, they get loaded up, and it got to where anyone producing oil and gas was engaged in manufacturing. Anyone producing electricity was engaged in manufacturing. All kinds of things were put in and given the benefit of Section 199, which nobody started out thinking would qualify as manufacturing. So that's one example of something that could be eliminated. There are some renewable energy provisions that I think we should phase out, without a doubt. But we ought to phase them out on a rational basis where we make a decision as to how many years it will take for these technologies to be mature, and not just give them a one-year extension and then another one-year extension and then allow them to lapse a year and then start them up again, which has been our policy.
Final question, there are a couple of parts to it. You talked about the program of loan guarantees and how it's had some major impact. A few questions. What are the success stories, or you mentioned one, but we've heard a lot of the criticism. What are the sort of proof points about why it's a positive? Two is carbon capture and storage a technology that should continue to be supported there? And finally, on the solar slide, you mentioned how the prices got lower because of Chinese support for basically photovoltaic cells. Is that something you think has been a good thing or a bad thing? There's always been a lot of accusations about China's policy stance. How do you see that interacting?
Well, first on the China issue, my own view is that for the long term, we ought to maintain a capability to produce photovoltaic cells. I hate to see us cede that technology entirely to the Chinese or anybody, the Germans or anybody else. And I think we're in danger of ceding that to the Chinese or the Germans in the future. I think what we did with the semiconductor industry when they were facing very difficult international competition was we created Semitech. We did a variety of things to maintain a domestic capability to produce semiconductors. I think that has served our country very well. I think we should be doing the same kind of thing with regard to photovoltaic cells. Tell me the other two things.
Other two is carbon capture and storage as a source of loan guarantees, and if you want to make the case for a loan guarantee program, what are your top line arguments?
Well, my view is that particularly in recent years with the economic downturn, the loan guarantee program has allowed us to go ahead and build out a lot of renewable energy projects that would not have been built otherwise absent that loan guarantee program. It has also allowed us to support the development of new technologies, which would not have been able to get commercial financing, and some of that has failed. I mean, Solyndra is a prime example of one that failed. But again, I think either we're going to try to remain competitive in development of some of these technologies and use the ability to provide loan guarantees to do that, or we're going to cede that to others, which I think is unfortunate. On carbon capture and storage, the reality is we have invested in trying to demonstrate that technology and that capability as a way to move toward cleaner use of coal. The truth is, with the low price of natural gas, if the price of natural gas stays as low as it currently is, or anywhere near as low as it currently is, it doesn't make economic sense to do carbon capture and storage. And I think that's a reality that we may have to acknowledge at some point. It only makes good economic sense to pursue carbon capture and storage if you're having to pay a substantially higher price for natural gas as the alternative.
I really can't thank you enough, Jeff, for your discussion with us. This was really enlightening and enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So as I invite you all to join myself, Senator Bingaman, his wife Ann, and the rest of our team at a reception, I want to give you one encouragement. For all the students in the audience, can you raise your hands? Okay. Please seek them out. They're going to be a little bit more shy about seeking you out, although we're encouraging them all to work on their networking skills. But help them out by reaching out to them. They really want your guidance, mentorship, and we would appreciate you taking some time with them in the reception. So thank you all very much. That was fast.